Growing up, I always knew I wasn't the favored one. My brother, Caleb, was the golden child in every sense of the word. Handsome, outgoing, and seemingly flawless in the eyes of my parents, he could do no wrong. I was the quieter, bookish one, more introspective, less flashy. Maybe it was because I didn't try as hard to earn their approval, maybe it was just that no matter what I did, it would never compare to Caleb's effortless charm. Our family's love was a currency, and Caleb always seemed to have a never-ending supply of it, while I got the leftovers, if there were any. Years later, when I met Emma, I finally felt like I'd found someone who genuinely saw me for who I was. Emma was warm and kind, at least at the beginning. She understood my quieter nature and appreciated the way I viewed the world. We fell in love quickly, and I believed that I'd finally found the one person who would choose me over anyone else. We got married in a small ceremony, just a few close friends, my family, and, of course, Caleb. At the time, I brushed off the way Emma and Caleb got along so easily. They were both sociable, always laughing at each other's jokes, sharing the same sarcastic humor that had always made me feel like a bit of an outsider. It stung to see the effortless connection they shared, but I dismissed it. They were my wife and my brother, and I trusted them both. Little did I know that this connection would be the beginning of my worst nightmare. Our marriage was good, at least on the surface. We'd built a life together, and I thought we were both content. I worked hard to provide for us, moving up the ranks at a tech company in the city. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I was finally starting to see some progress, hoping to make a better life for us. Things started changing about a year into our marriage. Emma became distant, often preoccupied and glued to her phone, brushing me off with vague excuses about work or meeting friends. I sensed something was wrong, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd dismiss it as me being paranoid. My self-doubt, drilled into me by years of feeling like I was never enough, made me second-guess myself. Caleb was around more than ever, coming by to check in or see how we were doing. He was the supportive brother, always telling me how lucky I was to have Emma. My parents adored him even more for his devotion to family. I, on the other hand, was just happy that my family finally seemed to accept me more because of my marriage. I clung to the illusion, trying not to notice the subtle glances, the fleeting touches between my wife and brother that were hidden behind layers of supposed innocence. But then the bombshell dropped. One night, after coming home late from work, I found Caleb in my kitchen. It was past midnight, and he looked like he'd been there for hours. He wore an expression I couldn't quite place, something between guilt and defiance. Emma wasn't home, and the silence in the house felt thick, suffocating. I asked him what he was doing, why he was here so late. Caleb gave me a smirk, his usual charming facade slipping just enough for me to see something darker underneath. "Just thought I'd come by and make sure everything's okay with you and Emma," he said, a statement that was both concerned and taunting, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Something snapped in me that night, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that this was more than what it seemed. Days later, the truth came out in the ugliest way possible. Emma had been seeing Caleb behind my back for months. My brother, the same brother who'd been the favorite, the one I'd looked up to despite all the resentment, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And, as if that wasn't enough, Emma was pregnant. Not with my child, but with Caleb's. When I confronted them, my family took Caleb and Emma's side without a second thought. They said things like, "You're just bitter because Caleb was always the better son, and, maybe if you'd been more like your brother, she wouldn't have strayed." Those words cut deeper than I could ever have imagined. It was as though my worst fears were validated, as though everything I'd ever worried about, never being enough, never being worthy, was true. And so, I walked away. I signed the divorce papers, left the family, and focused on my work. My job became my lifeline, my source of purpose, and over the next couple of years, I rose through the ranks. Promotions, pay raises, I was finally achieving something for myself, building a life of my own. I put my head down and worked harder than ever, ignoring the whispers about Caleb and Emma's growing family and their so-called perfect life. Then, life took a turn. Recently, I got a huge promotion, one that not only came with a hefty salary but also respect and recognition from people in my field. Ironically, just as I was finding my place, my phone started ringing. It was my family, the same family that had abandoned me, the same people who had sided with my ex-wife and my brother. They were asking for money. Apparently, Caleb's perfect life wasn't so perfect after all, and their finances were in ruins. Standing there, looking at the flashing caller ID on my phone, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. But the question remains, would I give in and help them, or would I finally stand my ground? I stared at the phone screen, my mother's name flashing insistently. For years, this woman had barely spoken to me, taking every opportunity to remind me that Caleb was the son she always wanted. Now she was calling, not out of love or reconciliation, but because she needed something from me. My finger hovered over the decline button, but something made me pause. A part of me, the part that was still that lonely kid, wanted to hear her voice. I answered, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Hello, Mom." "Oh, honey. It's so good to hear your voice," she exclaimed, her tone saccharine. It was strange hearing her sound so eager, as though we were on the best of terms. "How have you been, dear? We've missed you." "Really?" I replied, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "That's news to me." There was a pause on her end, and then she sighed, her voice lowering into something softer, almost pleading. "Look, I know things haven't been easy between us. But, sometimes life takes unexpected turns." I knew where this was going, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. But my curiosity got the better of me. "Is everything okay?" "Oh, well, Caleb, he's going through a rough time," she said, a note of hesitation creeping in. "You know he's got so much on his plate now, with the baby and other things. It's hard for him to manage. And your father and I, well, we're not as young as we used to be." I could feel my patience wearing thin. "So, what exactly do you need from me, Mom?" She hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. "Your brother, he's struggling with some financial issues. His business, well, it's had a few setbacks, and they're really struggling." This was laughable. Caleb had always been the golden boy, the one with the flawless life and the adoration of everyone around him. And now he was floundering, desperate enough to send our mother to grovel on his behalf. I almost wanted to laugh, but I held back. "So, Caleb's having money problems. And you thought of calling me. Why?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Why call the son you didn't think twice about abandoning?" "Oh, don't be like that," she said, trying to sound maternal, though it only made her tone more strained. "We're still family, after all. Blood is thicker than water. Blood is thicker than water." It was a phrase I'd heard countless times growing up, always directed at me when I tried to pull away from Caleb's shadow. Whenever I'd complained about how he always got the lion's share of love and attention, my parents would tell me that family was everything. But when I needed them most, they'd abandoned me. Blood may be thicker than water, but that didn't seem to matter when you all took his side after what he and Emma did to me, I shot back. I could feel years of resentment bubbling up, anger mingling with a sick sense of satisfaction. They had thrown me to the wolves, and now they wanted my help. "Look," she began, trying to recover, "maybe we didn't handle things perfectly back then. But we were shocked, too. You know Caleb has always been, well, he's always been different. And Emma, she's—" "Stop," I interrupted. "Don't try to explain it away. I don't want to hear excuses for them anymore." Another silence stretched between us, heavier this time. I imagined her sitting there, scrambling to think of the right words to pull me back in. For once, I had the power in this relationship, and it felt intoxicating. "Listen," she finally said, her tone more desperate, almost begging now. Please, just think about it. We're family. Your father and I, we just want what's best for everyone. Maybe you could help Caleb out a little, you know. Just a small loan. I couldn't believe this. A loan? I said, practically laughing. How much are we talking about? Well, he's got a lot of expenses. You know how it is with kids. A few $1,000s, maybe. Just enough to get him back on his feet, she said, her voice overly hopeful. So that was it. Not only did they want my money, but they expected me to hand it over without question. They hadn't cared about me when I was down, when I'd been shattered by their betrayal. Now, just because I'd built a life for myself and risen above their petty drama, they wanted a piece of it. Mom, let me ask you something, I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. If the roles were reversed, if I was the one struggling and Caleb was successful, would you be calling him to ask for help for me? There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her struggling to come up with an answer that wouldn't expose her favoritism. That's not fair, honey, she said weakly. You know Caleb has always needed a little more support. Right, I replied, my tone colder than I intended. And that's exactly why I don't feel the need to support him now. He made his choices, and so did you. So, forgive me if I don't feel particularly inclined to bail him out. But he's your brother, she insisted, her voice trembling. Please, just think about it. For me. I wanted to slam the phone down, to finally put an end to this twisted loyalty they kept expecting from me. But I also knew that cutting them off would only fuel their narrative that I was the selfish one, the bad son who turned his back on family. I'll think about it, I said finally, though I didn't mean it. I just wanted to end the call. Thank you, she said, relief flooding her voice. That's all I ask. But as I hung up, I knew deep down that I was done with Caleb and Emma, and, perhaps, my parents, too. The scars they'd left were too deep to heal with a simple apology or some half-hearted plea for forgiveness. They had chosen Caleb over me time and time again, and now they wanted me to be their savior. As I sat alone in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. I knew my family. They wouldn't give up so easily. And I'd have to decide, once and for all, whether to be the man they always accused me of being, the selfish one who refused to help, or to rise above, even if that meant handing them what they wanted. The days that followed my mother's call were a whirlwind of emotions. I'd built my life around moving forward, convincing myself that my family was behind me and that I didn't need them. But this phone call had cracked open wounds I thought had long healed, bringing back memories of a time when I would have done anything to make them proud. Now, they were the ones who needed something from me. It was a strange and twisted form of justice. I went back to work and tried to focus, but the thought of them asking me for help gnawed at me. Part of me felt like I should take the high road, prove to them that I wasn't the selfish, unworthy son they'd always thought I was. Maybe helping Caleb would finally show them the kind of man I had become. But then, every time I thought about that, a bitter voice in the back of my mind reminded me of everything they had done to me. My thoughts kept turning to Emma. The way she'd looked at me during our marriage, with that glimmer of affection that I now knew had always been a lie. I'd spent months thinking I wasn't good enough, that I'd somehow driven her into Caleb's arms. But the truth was, she and Caleb had chosen this path long before I even had a chance to prove myself. I couldn't just forgive that. Not now, not ever. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and paper, something I hadn't done in years. Writing was something I used to love, a way to organize my thoughts, but I'd abandoned it when life got busier. Now, I found myself scribbling, letting all the emotions pour out. Each word was like a release, a way to finally confront the pain I'd held inside. As I wrote, an idea started to form in my mind, a way to get the closure I needed without giving them the satisfaction of knowing they'd won. I wasn't going to just hand them money. No, if they wanted something from me, they were going to have to earn it. Caleb, Emma, my parents, they were going to see exactly who I had become, and they would be reminded of every lie, every slight, every betrayal. The next day, I took time off work to pay Caleb a visit. It wasn't something I looked forward to, but I needed to see him face to face. I had a plan, and I intended to follow through with it. Caleb's house was a modest one, far smaller than what I'd expected for someone who had once flaunted his supposed success. The garden was overgrown, and the paint on the walls was chipping, a stark contrast to the image of perfection he'd always tried to maintain. I rang the doorbell and waited, mentally preparing myself. The door swung open, and there he was, my brother, looking slightly thinner, his confident smile replaced with a weariness that made him look older. He stared at me, clearly surprised. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Can we talk?" He paused for a moment before nodding, stepping aside to let me in. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I followed him to the living room, where he gestured for me to sit down. Emma wasn't around, and for that, I was grateful. I wasn't sure I could face her just yet. "So," he said, sitting across from me and crossing his arms, the hint of his usual arrogance creeping back into his posture. "What brings you here?" I met his gaze, my own expression hard. "Mom called. Told me you're having issues. Said you could use some help." Caleb sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. "Yeah, well, things haven't exactly been easy lately. You know how it is." I didn't respond, letting the silence hang between us until he shifted uncomfortably. I wanted him to feel uneasy, to realize that he couldn't just waltz into my life expecting my help after everything he'd done. "What exactly happened, Caleb?" I asked finally, my voice low and steady. He hesitated, glancing away, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of shame in his eyes. "The business didn't take off like I'd planned. I made some investments that didn't pan out. And with the baby," his voice trailed off, and he looked back at me with a pleading expression. "Look, I know I messed up. But you don't know what it's like, having a kid, trying to provide." I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to lash out. Caleb didn't know what it was like to provide. I'd spent years working hard, scraping by, and trying to build something out of nothing while he had coasted by on charm and good looks. Now, suddenly, he was trying to play the role of the struggling father. "I don't know what it's like," I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "Caleb, you've never worked for anything in your life. You took everything from me, my family's love, my marriage, and now you want me to bail you out?" He looked taken aback, and for a moment, I saw a flash of guilt on his face. "It's not like that," he mumbled, but I cut him off. "Then tell me what it is like," I demanded, leaning forward. "Convince me that I should help you. After everything you've done, why should I?" He didn't answer, staring at his hands as if they held some kind of answer. Finally, he looked up, his face crumbling. "I don't have anyone else to ask. Emma, she doesn't even know how bad things are. And Mom and Dad, they don't have the money. You're the only one who can help." I felt a twisted satisfaction at his admission of defeat, but I kept my expression neutral. "If I do this, I'll need something in return," I said. He looked up, hope sparking in his eyes. "Anything. Name it." I leaned back, folding my arms. "I want you to tell me why. Why you did what you did with Emma. I want the truth. No excuses, no blaming anyone else. Just the truth." Caleb's face paled, and he looked away, his expression tightening. He was trapped, and he knew it. I wasn't just asking for a confession, I wanted him to confront his betrayal, to admit to himself and to me that he had shattered our family. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, okay? I guess. I was jealous. You were always so focused, so driven. I felt like I was just coasting, like nothing I did would ever measure up to you. I scoffed, barely able to believe what I was hearing. Jealous? Of me? He looked up, his face flushed with shame. Yeah. You never needed anyone's approval. You just did your own thing. I don't know, maybe I wanted to see if I could take something from you for once. And Emma, she made it easy. Hearing him admit it out loud brought a strange sense of closure, but it also deepened the anger I felt. His jealousy, his need to prove something, had destroyed my life. And now, he was here, begging me for help. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here's my offer, I said, my voice cold and unyielding. I'll think about helping you. But I want more than just an apology, Caleb. I want you to live with the consequences of what you did. You don't get to run from this. He nodded, defeated, his eyes filled with regret. And as I stood to leave, I felt a sense of control, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. This time, I was the one calling the shots. And Caleb, the golden child, was finally seeing what it was like to live in my shadow. Back at home, Caleb's confession kept replaying in my mind. It was absurd, he envied me. He had been the center of my family's world since we were kids. He had everything I never did, their constant support, praise, and affection. Yet, somehow, he resented me for working hard, for not needing their validation as he did. For years, I had believed I wasn't enough for them, that my failures were the reason they treated Caleb better. But now, I saw that I had been a scapegoat for his insecurities all along. I spent that night trying to shake off the anger that had been reignited. I realized that, more than anything, I wanted Caleb to face the full impact of his actions. He had admitted his faults, but had he truly felt remorse? The small, ugly part of me that I usually tried to ignore was whispering that he deserved to feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Emma was as much a part of this as Caleb. She'd betrayed me not only as my wife but also as the person I'd trusted most. I decided it was time to confront her, too, so I called her, explaining that I wanted to discuss financial matters. She agreed to meet without hesitation, which almost made me laugh. Was she so eager to reconnect now that she and Caleb were in need? We met at a coffee shop, and as soon as I saw her, I could tell she was struggling. Her makeup couldn't hide the lines on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes. But despite her obvious discomfort, she tried to engage in small talk, like we were old friends. I cut her off. I don't want pleasantries, Emma. I want the truth. Why did you do it? She stumbled, making excuses about feeling neglected and unappreciated, as if her betrayal had been my fault. Each word she spoke only intensified my resentment. Finally, I told her the real reason I'd come, to make sure she knew that I was thriving, without her or Caleb. She stared at me, speechless, as I left, and it felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost when she betrayed me. Emma's words had stirred up old wounds, but I didn't let her see how deeply she'd hurt me. Instead, I walked away, feeling empowered, as if I'd finally broken the last chains that had bound me to her and my past. I'd always wanted to believe that Emma and Caleb had some justification, that maybe I had done something to drive them together. But now, I saw it for what it was, a betrayal born of their own insecurities and weaknesses. Word about my recent promotion and financial success had made its way through the family grapevine. My mother started calling again, but I ignored her messages until my father reached out, claiming he wanted to reconnect. He played it off as a fatherly gesture, but I could sense the desperation beneath his words. I agreed to meet him, knowing full well that this wasn't just about family bonds, it was about money. At the cafe, he sat across from me, looking uncomfortable as he tried to pretend we were a close family. He danced around the topic, avoiding eye contact, until finally, he admitted they needed financial help. Caleb's in a tough spot, he mumbled, as if the mere admission was painful. The business didn't go well, and now with the baby, he trailed off, looking at me expectantly, as if my sympathy alone would open my wallet. I stayed calm, letting him squirm. For years, I had lived under the weight of his favoritism toward Caleb, and now here he was, needing me. It was both satisfying and tragic, realizing that my family's love had always been conditional. I told him that if they wanted my help, they would have to earn it. They had ignored me for years, but now I was calling the shots. I laid down my terms, refusing to budge as he tried to reason with me. "You never wanted my help before, Dad," I said quietly, watching him wince. "Why now?" He hesitated, fumbling for words. "It's not about that. You're family, and family helps each other." "Family helps each other?" I echoed, shaking my head. Funny how that only matters now, when Caleb's in trouble. Eventually, he stopped trying to argue and simply sat in silence, waiting for my conditions. I told him that if they wanted my help, Caleb would have to publicly acknowledge his betrayal. He would have to face our family, confess what he had done, and apologize. No excuses, no justifications. My father's face paled, but I stood firm. They'd taken so much from me, this was the only way they could begin to make amends. Reluctantly, my father agreed, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. It didn't matter. They would finally see that I wasn't the same man they had dismissed for years. I had changed, and they would have to accept it. A few days later, Caleb called, furious. He accused me of trying to humiliate him, of forcing him to grovel. I listened calmly, letting him vent his anger. When he finally paused, I reminded him that he was the one asking for help, not the other way around. If he wanted to keep his pride, he was free to do so. But he wouldn't get a single penny from me. After a long silence, he reluctantly agreed to my terms, his voice tight with resentment. I hung up, feeling a strange sense of victory. Caleb would finally be held accountable, and my family would see him for who he truly was. We arranged a family gathering for Caleb's confession, and the tension in the room was palpable. My parents looked uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for the truth to come out. Caleb stood before us, his face red with shame, as he admitted to his betrayal, explaining how his jealousy had driven him to betray his own brother. He stammered through his apology, barely able to meet my gaze. I watched my family's reactions closely. My mother looked shocked, my father ashamed. For the first time, they were forced to confront the reality of who Caleb was and the consequences of their favoritism. After Caleb's confession, my parents approached me, their expressions a mixture of guilt and sorrow. They tried to apologize, stumbling over their words as they acknowledged the years of neglect and unfair treatment. It felt surreal, hearing them finally admit their mistakes. But the years of hurt and resentment couldn't be erased so easily. Their words were too little, too late. I accepted their apologies, but I made it clear that things would never be the same. I wasn't interested in rekindling old family ties, I had moved on, and they needed to understand that. My father approached me afterward, bringing up the financial support I had promised. I nodded, handing over a check, but not without a parting message. "This doesn't make us even," I told him. "This is just closure." He looked at me, his face tight with regret, but he didn't argue. For the first time, I felt truly free, free from their expectations, their judgments, and the weight of their favoritism. In the weeks that followed, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Caleb, Emma, my parents, they no longer held any power over me. I had confronted my past, faced those who had hurt me, and emerged stronger. My family had become mere acquaintances, reminders of the man I used to be. I felt no desire to reconnect, no need for their approval. I had built my own life, and for the first time, that felt like enough. With my family's betrayals behind me, I finally felt at peace. I'd faced the darkest parts of my past, looked betrayal in the eye, and walked away, stronger than ever. My life was my own now, no longer shaped by their judgments or expectations. I was free to pursue my own dreams, to live for myself, without the burden of their favoritism or approval. The shadows of betrayal had finally lifted, leaving me with a future that was fully my own.